I had governed the Thornreach border for 3 years before I learned what fear actually was, and it did not come to me the way the old songs promise it will come to a king. Not in the clash of steel, not in the long nights weighing a treaty that might cost me half my riders, not even in the winter the fever took a third of my hold before Briar Fenwick's father found the herb that broke it. It came to me on an ordinary gray morning in the second month of true winter, on a supply road I had ridden 100 times without incident, and it came wearing the shape of a stranger throwing her body between a blade and a boy she barely knew. I want to tell this rightly, from the start, because I have learned since that a story told out of order loses the thing that makes it true. The Asheville Pack holds the northernmost border of the Wolflands, where the good soil gives out and the mountains start in earnest. And for 3 years the Vareth raiders had come down out of those mountains every hard winter to take what they could not grow themselves, grain, livestock, sometimes a captive to ransom or worse. My father had held this border for 30 years before me and died holding it, and I had inherited both the hold and the war in the same season, 28 years old and entirely unprepared for either. I tell you this so you understand what kind of man knelt in that snow. Not a soft king, not an idle one, a man who had buried more soldiers than he could count on both hands and had long since stopped expecting anything in his life to surprise him. The convoy that morning was routine. 6 wagons of grain and salted meat moving between Thornreach Hold and the smaller outpost at Grayfen, 20 riders as escort, myself among them because a king who does not know his own roads is not fit to defend them. We were 3 miles out from Grayfen when the eastern watchtower horn sounded twice, which meant raiders, close and moving fast. I have relived the next quarter hour more times than I can count, and I still cannot make it move any slower in my memory. The Vareth came down off the ridge in a formation I recognized, a pincer meant to split the convoy and pick off the wagons at the rear, where the greenest of my riders always rode because I had, foolishly, believed the rear to be the safer position. Tam was among them. 16 years old, 3 months into his first posting, a boy who still flinched at the sound of his own bowstring. I broke from the front line the moment I understood the shape of the attack, but a horse, however fast, cannot outrun an ambush already sprung. By the time I crested the last low ridge before the rear wagons, the fighting had already turned ugly. 2 of my riders down, the wagons overturned, Tam thrown from his horse and scrambling backward through the snow with a Vareth raider closing on him, blade already raised. And between them, appearing from nowhere I could account for, a woman in a healer's gray cloak. She had been riding with the convoy. I learned this only later, learned that she made the Grayfen circuit twice a month to tend the outpost sick, and had simply, quietly, always done so without any escort thinking to remark on her presence, because a healer among soldiers is furniture, useful and unremarked. She threw herself over Tam's crouched body with her arms spread as though a healer's gray cloak could turn aside a blade forged for war, and I heard her say it, clear across the distance, clear enough that it has never once left me since. Take me instead. I do not know if she meant it as strategy or as pure reflex, the animal instinct of a body placing itself between harm and the smaller thing it has decided to protect. I have asked her since, and she has never quite answered, which I have come to understand is its own kind of answer. What I know is that the blade came down, and it did not miss, and I was still 40 yards off when I saw her fall. I have led men into worse things than that skirmish. I gave the order to break the ambush's rear flank without my voice shaking, because a king's voice cannot shake in front of his riders no matter what his chest is doing. But when I reached her, when I threw myself off my horse before it had fully stopped and went down on my knees in red-going black snow, I do not think my voice was steady at all. "Get the healer," I said to no one, to everyone, and someone, I think it was Perrin, my own healer, arriving breathless from the front of the column, told me gently that there was no other healer out here, that she was the healer, the only one this side of Thornreach Hold, and that I had best decide quickly what I meant to do about that. So I did the thing I had not done since I was a green boy first learning the weight of a sword. I pressed my bare hands to a wound that was not mine, and I did not let go. She was breathing, shallow and wrong, blood coming too fast between my fingers no matter how I pressed, but breathing, and I held on to that single fact the way a drowning man holds a rope. She threw herself over him, Tam said, somewhere behind me, his voice cracking with a shock that had not yet let him understand he was unhurt. She didn't even look at the blade. She just said, take me instead, and she didn't even look. I did not have words then for what was moving through my chest. It was not the mate bond of the old songs, not some bright singing certainty. It was closer to dread, closer to the lurch of a man's foot finding no ground where ground should be, a recognition that had asked no permission of me at all, as though some door in me had been standing ajar for years without my noticing, and had just now, at the worst possible moment, been thrown fully open. I carried her the 3 miles back to Thornreach myself, on my own horse, wrapped in my own cloak, and I would not let any other rider take the weight of her. Perrin rode alongside with 2 fingers pressed constant to her throat, calling out the count of her pulse every quarter mile like a man keeping time against something he did not trust to hold. It held barely, all the way home it held. The healing hall at Thornreach is a poor thing by any measure a southern lord would use, a converted grain store with low beams and braziers that never quite drive the cold from the corners, its shelves lined with dried herbs instead of gold-leafed instruments. Its only real luxury, a good, deep hearth that had been Briar's father's one demand when he took over the trade 20 years past. I had walked by that building perhaps 1,000 times in 3 years of governing this hold. I could not, before that day, have told you the healer's name. Briar Fenwick, 26 years old, daughter of old Fenwick, who had held the healer's post at Thornreach for 2 decades before his hands grew too unsteady for stitching, and his daughter, trained at his side since she was old enough to hold a needle, simply took up the work without ceremony or announcement, because a boarder hold in a hard winter has no patience for ceremony and no gold to spare for titles. She was paid in grain and firewood and the occasional bolt of good wool, and she asked for little more than that. And in 3 years of riding past her door I had never once thought to learn her name, because a hold's healer is like its well or its granary, essential and invisible, until the day it is not. Perrin worked the wound closed by lamplight while I knelt on the healing hall's cold floor and held her hand, and he told me, more than once, with the particular bluntness of a man who has served 2 kings and buried a mate of his own, and has therefore stopped being afraid of speaking plainly to either, that I ought to leave, that a king kneeling on a floor in another man's blood was no fit sight for a hold already frightened by an ambush on its own road. I did not leave. I have never once in 31 years been afraid of my own dying. I discovered that night that I am entirely undone by the fear of someone else's, and I discovered it with a stranger's calloused hand gripped in both of mine, her breath going shallow and catching and evening again, in a rhythm I found myself matching without deciding to. Perrin worked through the worst of it in under an hour. The blade had caught her along the ribs, deep, but by some mercy I have thanked every old god I know of since, missing the organs beneath by the width of a finger. What remained after that was fever and blood loss, and the long uncertain hours where a body decides for itself whether it means to keep living. I stayed through all of them. Somewhere past midnight, with her fever climbing and Perrin's face gone grim in the lamplight, I felt something rise beneath my own collarbone, not pain, not quite warmth, a low insistent pull, as though my body had decided without consulting me that it now belonged to the rhythm of her breathing and would not settle until hers did. "That's not a fever, Mark," Perrin said, some hours later, looking not at her but at me, at the faint gold shimmer just visible where my collar had come loose in the night's work. He set down the cloth he'd been using to cool her brow and looked at me the way a man looks at another man he has decided, after long observation, to finally speak plainly to. Cassian. You know what that is. I know what it looks like. Does it matter what it looks like if it's true? I did not answer him. I did not have an answer, not that night, not with her breath still catching and her fever still climbing, and no certainty at all that I would have the chance to learn what any of it meant. I only had her hand, and the strange new understanding, arriving all at once entire, the way understanding sometimes does, that I had spent 3 years riding past a door that had, without my knowledge, always been mine to open. Perrin's own mate had died in the fever winter before I took the hold. He did not speak of her often. That night, watching me, he said only, mine came on slow. A season of not understanding why I kept finding reasons to walk past her cottage. Yours came on like a blade falling. I'd wager that's harder to carry, not easier. Don't waste it pretending you don't feel what you feel, boy. I did that for half a year once out of pride, and it cost me time I never got back. I did not answer that either, but I did not let go of her hand. She did not wake that first night, nor the second. The fever broke on the morning of the third day, which Perrin called good fortune, and I called the longest 70 hours of my life, and even then she did not wake so much as surface. Pale, disoriented, murmuring names I did not know, sleeping again within the hour. I did not leave the healing hall in all that time, except to hold counsel with my captains at its outer table, which I had my men drag in on the second day. When it became clear I meant to govern the border from that room, whether anyone thought it fit or not. Word travels fast in a small hold, and faster still when the thing traveling is strange. By the second day, half of Thornreach had found some reason to pass the healing hall's open door. Soldiers who had ridden past Briar Fenwick 100 times without a second glance now lingering in the doorway to ask after her. Tam's mother arriving in tears on the first evening, to press both of Briar's slack hands between her own and weep her thanks over a woman too fevered to hear them. My own captains, Aldrich and Rena, standing a little straighter and speaking a little more carefully whenever her name came up, as though rank in this hold had been quietly and permanently redrawn, without anyone issuing the order. It was Rena, my sharpest captain and no fool about matters of pack instinct, who said to me on the second evening, low enough that only I would hear it, "The men have seen the mark, Cassian. You know they have. There's no keeping a thing like that quiet in a hold this size." "Then let them see it," I said. "I've nothing to hide and no wish to." "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking whether you understand what it will mean, once the council in the south hears of it. Lord Asheville's cousin has been pressing for the Ilarian match since your father's time. A border king mated to an unranked healer instead of Lady Ilara's line. There will be talk." I had, in fact, not thought of the council at all in those 3 days, which perhaps tells you everything about where my attention had gone. I thought of it now briefly, and found that it moved me not at all. "Let there be talk," I said, and went back to holding a stranger's hand. I will tell that part of the story properly in its place, because it did come. The council's objections did not stay hypothetical for long. But that first week, I confess, I gave it almost no room in my thoughts at all. I had a woman fighting her way back from a blade meant for another, and beside that, the opinions of southern lords who had never once ridden this border themselves seemed a very small thing. She woke properly on the 4th day, to find a king asleep sitting bolt upright in a chair built for sitting in an hour, not 4 days, and by her own account, delivered dry as kindling once she had strength enough to be dry about anything, assumed, quite reasonably, that she was either dreaming or dead or possibly both, and was leaning toward dead on the grounds that the chair looked entirely too uncomfortable for a dream. "You're neither," I told her, my voice rough with 4 days of no real sleep. Once I understood she was actually speaking and not still murmuring through fever. "Though you came near enough to the second option that I'd rather you not test the theory further." "The boy," she said first, before she asked anything at all about herself, before she even seemed to register the ache of her own body. "Tam, is he unhurt because of you?" She looked for a moment, genuinely puzzled that this needed saying at all, as though throwing herself into a raider's blade for a boy she'd known perhaps a season had cost her nothing worth remarking on, as though it were simply the obvious and unremarkable thing any healer would do. That more than the mark beneath my shirt, more than 4 days of a pull in my chest that had not eased once, was the moment I understood precisely what kind of woman fate, or the old gods, or whatever governs these things, had granted me. "You've been asleep 4 days," I told her. "Perrin says you're mending well. I'd like you to believe him and rest, though I have already gathered you're not the sort of woman who rests easily." "I have patience," she said, already trying to push herself upright and hissing sharply at the pull of stitches along her ribs. "Your patience," I said, "have been tended this week by half the hold, myself included, badly, and will survive a little longer under our poor care while you finish healing properly. Old Marrow's cough is worse for my attempts at your willowbark tea, I'll admit, but he is alive. And so, I am told, is everyone else you've been fretting after in your sleep." That got something from her, not quite a laugh. Her ribs would not have allowed it, but a small huff of breath that might have been the ancestor of one. "You made willowbark tea." "Badly, as I said." "You're a king. You don't make tea." "I have discovered," I said, "that I am willing to make a great many things I would not previously have considered, under the right circumstances." She looked at me then, properly looked, for the first time since waking, taking in the state of me, 4 days unshaven and unslept in a chair no king should have occupied for an hour, let alone 4 days, and something in her expression shifted, some calculation running behind her eyes that I would only later understand was her beginning already to suspect what had happened to me in that healing hall while she slept. She did not ask about it that day. I did not offer it. But I saw her glance once to the collar of my shirt, where the fabric had loosened enough in 4 sleepless days to show the faintest edge of gold, and I saw her look away again quickly, and say nothing, and I understood that she, too, had begun to feel the pull of something she did not yet have words for. The days that followed were not the swift, sweeping thing the old ballads promise. They were slower, stranger, and I have come to think since truer for being so. Briar mended slowly, as blade wounds to the ribs will make a body do, and for the better part of 2 weeks she was confined to the healing hall's back room, forbidden by Perrin from lifting anything heavier than a teacup, a restriction she obeyed with visible and constant reluctance. I moved my war table into the healing hall's outer room in truth, not merely as an excuse to remain near her, though I will not pretend that was not part of it. The border does not pause its dangers for a king's private matters, and Rena and Aldrich brought their reports to that low-beamed room as readily as they would have brought them to my own hall. Briar noticed this arrangement on the 3rd day of it and said, with the particular flatness of a woman deciding whether to be amused or exasperated, "No one has ever built a war table in my healing hall before." "No one has ever had reason to," I said. "And what reason is that precisely?" I did not answer that directly, not yet. I was not certain in those early days how much truth she was ready to bear alongside a still healing wound, and I had resolved, perhaps wrongly, though I do not regret it, that I would not lay the full weight of a king's mark on a woman who could not yet sit upright without the room tilting. But I stayed. Every evening, once the day's governing was done, I sat by her hearth instead of my own, and we spoke of small things at first. Of old Marrow's cough and the proper dose of willow bark, and how her father had taught her the trade from the age of 7, standing on a stool at his workbench because she was too small to reach it otherwise. Of my own father and the border, and the particular loneliness of a hold that expects its king to be strong in every room and soft in none. She told me on the 5th evening, why she had thrown herself over Tam without hesitation, not out of strategy, not out of some noble calculation, but because her own mother had died when Briar was 9, of a fever her father could not break in time, and she had decided, young, in the particular fierce way children decide such things, that she would never again stand by while someone she could reach was dying in front of her, if there was any way at all to place herself between them and the harm. "It wasn't bravery," she said, looking into the hearth rather than at me. "People keep calling it that. It wasn't. It was just I saw a boy about to die and I had a body I could put in the way and I used it. That's not a virtue. That's just what a healer's hands are for." "It is a virtue," I said. "The rarest kind, the kind that does not know itself as one." She did not answer that, but she did, for the first time, let her hand rest close enough to mine on the arm of her chair that our fingers nearly touched, and neither of us moved to close the last small distance, and neither of us moved away. The council's objections, when they came exactly as Rena had warned they would, and I will set them down honestly, because I think a story that hides its true obstacles is not worth the telling. Lord Asheville's cousin, Magistrate Voss, a thin, careful man who had served 3 border kings before me and outlasted all of them through sheer administrative patience, arrived at Thornreach in the 3rd week with a retinue of 6 and a letter from the Southern Council that he read aloud in my own hall, in front of my captains, in a voice pitched for maximum formality. The letter did not mention Briar by name. It did not need to. It spoke, in the careful language such letters always use, of the border's need for stable alliance, of the Ilarian match long under consideration, of the unfortunate rumors reaching the southern holds regarding a mark taken with an unranked healer of no lineage of note. I let him finish. I have learned, in 3 years of kingship, the value of letting a man finish a prepared speech before answering it. "The mark is not a rumor, Voss," I said when he had done. "It is a fact, and facts do not bend to a council's preferences regarding lineage. With respect, my lord, a mark can be misread. Grief, exhaustion, the fear of nearly losing someone in your own care, these can produce sensations a man might mistake. I have led men to their deaths on this border," I said, and I did not raise my voice, because I did not need to. "I know the difference between grief and this. I would ask you not to insult either my judgment or the woman in question by suggesting otherwise in her own hold." Voss was not, to his credit, a stupid man, and he heard the warning under the words. He shifted his approach, rather than abandoning it. "Then consider the border itself, my lord, if not the council's preference. The Ilarian match brings 400 riders and a grain surplus that has kept this hold fed through 2 hard winters already. What does the healer bring, beside her father's small trade?" It was Rena, not I, who answered that, and I have never loved her more as a captain than I did in that moment. "She brought a boy home alive who'd have died on that road without her," Rena said, "and she's kept half this hold breathing through 3 winters of fever and frostbite that the Southern Council never once sent a physician north to help with. I'd say she's brought more to this border in 3 years than Lady Alara's 400 riders have brought in 10, given they've never once been asked to actually ride here." Voss did not have a ready answer for that, and I confess, I allowed the silence to sit a moment longer than strictly necessary before I spoke again. "I will not break a faded mark for a grain surplus, Voss, whatever the council's preference. Tell them the border stands, and tell them it stands mated to a healer whose worth this hold has seen with its own eyes for 3 winters running, whatever the southern ledgers may say of her lineage." He left within the week, unsatisfied, and I do not doubt the council's objections were not finished. Such matters rarely resolve in a single conversation. But word of that hall council reached Briar before I could tell her of it myself, carried, I suspect, by Rena, who had little patience for letting a woman remain ignorant of a fight fought partly in her honor. She found me that evening not by the hearth but standing at the healing hall's window, looking out at the dark, and she came to stand beside me, steadier on her feet now, 3 weeks healed, though still careful of her ribs, and said, without preamble, "You didn't have to do that." "I did actually," I said. "Rather badly wanted to, if I'm honest, though I'd rather Voss not know how much I enjoyed it. 400 riders and a grain surplus is not a small thing to refuse for a hold at war." "No," I agreed, "it isn't. I refused it anyway. I find I would rather have a border thinner on grain and honest in its choices than one fed fat on an alliance I did not want, mated to a woman I did not choose, with a mark on my chest for someone else entirely that I would have spent the rest of my life pretending not to feel." She was quiet a long moment, watching the dark beyond the window, and when she spoke again her voice had lost some of its careful flatness. "I keep waiting to understand why it's me," she said. "I've turned it over every night since I woke. I'm no one Cashin. I'm a healer's daughter with grain and firewood for wages. I don't understand what a king's mark could possibly want with that." "I have asked myself the same question," I said, "and I have come to think it is not a question that has an answer, not the kind you're looking for. I did not choose you because of what you bring in riders or grain or lineage, Briar. I did not choose you at all, in the way you mean it. I knelt in the snow with your blood on my hands and understood all at once that I had been afraid of nothing in my life until the moment I thought I might lose something I had not yet had the chance to know. That is not a calculation. That is simply what happened to me. I don't think the bond asks whether a woman is fit for a crown before it decides she is fit for a man's whole heart." She turned to look at me then, and there was something in her face I had not seen there before, not disbelief, exactly, but the particular unguarded look of a woman allowing herself, cautiously, to consider that a thing might be true even though she had spent a lifetime expecting it not to be. "I still think you're mad," she said. "Refusing 400 riders for a healer's daughter." "Then we are matched," I said, "because I think you're mad for throwing yourself in front of a blade for a boy you'd known one season, and yet here we both are." That finally earned me the laugh her ribs had not allowed 3 weeks before, small, surprised out of her, quickly stifled with a wince, but real. I will not pretend the weeks that followed were without further difficulty, because a border does not pause its dangers to accommodate a king's courtship, and the Varith raiders, having lost men and pride in the failed ambush, did not simply retreat north and leave us in peace. They came again in the 6th week, smaller in number but sharper in purpose. A raid not on a supply road this time but on Thornreach Hold itself, under cover of a night storm that muffled the watchtower horns until the raiders were nearly through the outer palisade. I was in council when the alarm finally sounded, and my first thought, the thought that told me, more clearly than any mark or any pull in my chest, exactly how far I had already fallen, was not for the granary, nor the armory, nor even my own riders scrambling to their posts. It was for the healing hall, low-walled and poorly defended, where Briar would be tending whatever wounded the raid produced, exposed and unguarded, because no one in 3 years of war had ever thought the healer herself required protecting. I broke from the council table before Rena had finished relaying the watchtower's report and ran the distance to the healing hall myself, sword already drawn, and found her exactly where I feared, alone at her workbench, already laying out bandages and drawing water, preparing with steady, unhurried hands for wounded who had not yet arrived, entirely unguarded against the 3 raiders who had, by ill fortune, breached the palisade nearest her own door. I reached her before they did, though barely, and what followed I remember less as a sequence of decisions than as a single continuous motion. Sword meeting the first raider's blade, Perrin arriving a breath later to pull Briar back from the doorway, my own riders flooding in behind me to finish what the storm and the breach had started. It was over within minutes. It felt at the time considerably longer. When the hall was clear and the wounded finally did begin arriving, real wounded now, 6 of my own riders with cuts and burns from the fighting. I found Briar already moving among them with the same steady hand she had shown at her own bedside weeks before, giving no sign at all that she had, minutes earlier, come within a few feet of a raider's blade a second time in 2 months. It was only later, well past midnight, once the last wound was stitched and the last patient settled, that she allowed herself to sit finally, and I watched her hands steady through every stitch, every bandage, every calm instruction given to a frightened soldier begin at last to shake. I sat beside her and took both of them in mine, the way she had once taken one of mine in that same room, weeks before, when our positions had been reversed. "You didn't have to run to me," she said, once the shaking had eased. "I was managing." "I know," I said. "I ran anyway." "I imagine I will keep running to you, Briar, every time there is a reason to, for exactly as long as you'll allow it, and I find I have very little interest in pretending otherwise for the sake of looking less foolish." "That's not foolish." It felt considerably like it, sprinting across the hold in the middle of a council meeting with half my captains staring after me. "What did you tell them, afterward?" "Nothing," I said. "I didn't need to. Rena already knew. I suspect the whole hold already knows, and has for weeks, and has simply been waiting, with more patience than I deserve, for the 2 of us to catch up to what they've already understood." She was quiet a moment, looking down at our joined hands, and then she said low, "I threw myself in front of a blade for a boy I'd known one season because I couldn't bear the thought of standing by while someone died in reach of my hands. I think that's closer to what this is, for me, than any bond or mark. I don't know how to explain it better than that. I just find lately that I can't bear the thought of you running toward danger without me somewhere near enough to reach you, either." It was not, perhaps, the declaration the old ballads would have written for a king's fated mate. It was better, I have come to think, for being entirely her own, plain and honest, and given not because a mark demanded it but because she had chosen, in her own time and her own steady hands, to give it. The formal claiming, when it came, was nothing like the ceremonies the Southern holds favor, no hall full of watching lords, no crown lowered before an audience, no ritual words spoken to a room rather than to each other. Briar had made it plain in the weeks of her mending that she wanted none of that, and I had made it equally plain that I wanted only what she wanted, mark or no mark, crown or no crown. We sat instead by the Healing Hall's hearth on an evening in early spring, the last of the winter's fever cases finally cleared, old Marrow's cough finally broken for good, the border quieter than it had been in 3 years of war, whether from the Vareth's losses or from some gentler turn of fortune, I could not say, and did not much care to examine. "I have a table with your name carved into it now," I told her, "in my own hall beside mine, whether you ever choose to sit at it or not. I had it done in secret some weeks back, and I have been waiting rather impatiently for the right evening to tell you." "That's a strange sort of proposal," she said, though there was no sharpness in it. "I did not think you want the kind with an audience." "I wouldn't." She was quiet a moment, turning something over. I could see it in the small furrow of her brow, the same look she wore over a difficult wound, weighing what to try next. "I keep thinking of my father. He'd have laughed himself sick at the idea of his daughter mated to a king. He always said healers marry other healers, or no one, because no one else understands why we can't leave a wound half-tended to go to supper." "I have learned to eat a great many suppers cold this winter," I said, and found I minded it a great deal less than I expected. That earned the laugh again, freer now, her ribs long healed, nothing held back in it, and she reached, finally, for the hand I had left open on the arm of my chair, and closed her own around it. "I'm not going to become someone I'm not," she said. "I'll keep the Healing Hall. I'll keep tending old Marrow's cough myself, and every fever this border sends us, and I won't be moved into some Southern lord's idea of what a king's mate ought to look like. I would think considerably less of you if you tried to," I said. I did not fall for a woman willing to become someone else. I fell for the one who threw herself in front of a blade without looking, because it was simply the thing her hands knew how to do. I have no wish for any other version of you. She looked at me a long moment then, the firelight catching gold where the mark still rested faint beneath my collar, and something in her expression settled. Not the fierce readiness I had seen in her at the ambush, nor the guarded uncertainty of those first mending weeks, but something quieter, and I think, finally, something certain. "Then yes," she said simply, without ceremony, exactly as she had lived every day of the 3 years I had ridden past her door without knowing her name. "I'll sit at your table. Cold suppers and all." I did not kneel before a watching hall, and no crown passed between us that evening, and the Border's Southern Council would go on grumbling about lineage and grain surpluses for a good while yet, unmoved and unbothered by either of us. What I remember of that night instead is smaller, and I think truer for it, her hand in mine by an ordinary hearth in a healing hall too poor for Southern taste, the low beams overhead, the smell of dried herbs that I have come since to think of as the smell of home. Thornreach Hold did not throw open its gates in celebration, nor did the pack that had overlooked her for 3 winters suddenly bow at her passing. It was slower than that, and better old Marrow bringing her the first spring greens from his garden as thanks rather than payment. Tam, grown a little steadier in the months since the ambush, standing straighter every time her name was spoken in his hearing. My own captains bringing their reports first to her hearth before they thought to bring them to my hall, because some quiet redrawing of the Hold's true center had happened, gradual and unremarked, exactly as she would have wanted it. I gave her no crown that spring. I gave her a chair by my table, my honest fear laid bare on a night I nearly lost her, and the whole slow, unhurried truth of what it meant to be chosen not before a watching court, but in the steady, ordinary hours of a Border learning, one saved life at a time, to say her name the way it should have been said all along.